Gauntlet is a hack-and-slash multiplayer franchise dating all the way back to 1985. While the series has been revamped on multiple occasions in an attempt to appeal to modern audiences, it never really evolved from its archaic foundations and has fallen into obscurity, seeing its last release nearly a decade ago. However, it nearly saw a transfiguration in the early 2000s, bringing together some of the best game developers in an attempt to rejuvenate the now mostly forgotten IP. This is the death of Gauntlet. Gauntlet and its subsequent 2D sequels were hugely successful in arcades in the late 80s and early 90s, taking a fistful of quarters from up to 4 players at a time in a never-ending fantasy campaign. Good things never last though, and the series struggled to stay relevant in the 3D era of the late 90s. After the mediocre reception of Gauntlet Legends and Dark Legacy, Midway Games knew they had to change something. The exact timeline is undocumented, but at some point in 2004, work began on a Gauntlet prototype that was intended to rework the game's age formula. While previous entries were relatively tame, Midway Games saw an opportunity to make Gauntlet like their flagship mature title, Mortal Kombat. To support this, they brought on FPS mastermind and speedrunning pioneer John Romero as project director, known for his work on Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake. The other major shift was including an actual story, something previous games lacked almost entirely. After the cancellation of Fallout 3 and the layoffs of Black Isle's development team, Midway attempted to solve this missing part of the equation by hiring all of Interplay's former employees. While that plan fell through, John Romero did manage to scout one of the team's best developers in Josh Sawyer, who had worked on Icewind Dale 2 previously, and would later go on to craft some of the greatest RPGs ever made in Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, and Pentiment. Midway didn't stop there though, recruiting developers like concept artist Ryan Meinerding and Vance Kovacs. Ryan would later go on to become the head of visual development at Marvel Studios, and Vance worked on many well-received titles like Fallout 2, Wasteland 2, and God of War. Inon Zur was even a part of the game's audio department, and while he was unknown then, he would go on to make countless bangers for Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Skilled artists from Act 3 Studio were also brought in to work on pre-rendered cinematics that would be used to tell much of the expanded storyline. Lead programmer Boris Batkin was brought on too, and would later work on standouts like BioShock, Killzone, and XCOM. The game was originally developed using the Renderware graphics engine, which powered titles like Grand Theft Auto and Burnout. However, Boris and the team were unsatisfied, eventually replacing it with their own engine they wrote from scratch. It wasn't just the team that was passionate to deliver a great product, but even the publisher, as Midway was determined for it to get at least an 80% Metacritic score. And so work began in earnest on Gauntlet 7 Sorrows, and it was planned to be released on PS2 and Xbox in winter of 2005. The plan was to feature the button-mashing madness of the original games, but adding in Street Fighter-inspired combat including trips, block breaking, grabbing, throwing, counterattacking, and juggling, on top of the addition of RPG systems, online combat, extreme violence, a darker tone, and a real story. Gauntlet now had 2 of the most influential developers in the entire industry leading a talented team, and for a short time it appeared that Gauntlet was not only going to be brought back to life, but reach untold heights. The title was officially announced in February of 2005, and early previews detailed the changes the team intended. While the playable characters had very little lore in previous entries, Josh Sawyer attempted to shake things up by giving them in-depth backstories, fleshing out not only the cultures they came from, but also the world itself by introducing a large cast of interesting NPCs. The campaign was intended to be played in co-op character pairs, the warrior and the Valkyrie, the elf and the mage, etc., and the story would be unique to each team, exploring the emotional baggage of each hero. Josh Sawyer also made 2 new intriguing character classes, and during several interviews he detailed them, stating, The Lancer and Tragedian are two new characters, and they both hail from an African-inspired land called Ajanku Uriel and Endofa. The Lancer was once a cavalry officer who rode on the back of the mythic Great Ones. Huge and terrifying beasts that were considered unstoppable. The arrogance of the Lancer Corps eventually provoked a conflict with Ajanku Uriel's imperial allies. In the end, the Lancer Corps was destroyed, the Great Ones were exterminated, and the great library and academy of the Lancers was ruined. He is very proud and well educated, and quickly wears on the nerves of the characters. In the story, he often acts as a foil to the other heroes. His primary weapon style is Great Pierce, long two-handed thrusting weapons. His attacks are very graceful and acrobatic, often using a weapon for vaulting or spinning overhead in a dangerous pattern. The Tragedian is the strangest character in the game. Though she is from the same culture as the Lancer, she shares very little in common with him. She was a performer of tragedies who became part of a terrorist network when the Empire began destroying the great works and artists of her culture. She was eventually captured and tortured for information, released a decade later. Her face and mouth are so mutilated that she cannot speak, and she wears her tragedy mask at all times. She uses a prostitute's form of sign language called Harlot's Tongue to communicate with some of the characters in the game. Her combat style is unarmed. It is a bit of a misnomer, because she uses weapons like punch daggers, cesti, claws, etc., while performing her lightning-fast attacks.
I'd like to start by saying that the four traditional Gauntlet characters, the warrior, the Valkyrie, the wizard, and the elf, are back in Seven Sorrows. But there's a lot more depth to the gameplay and the background behind each of these characters. In this presentation, John and I would like to show you how this next evolution in the series blends gameplay and story for a new, compelling experience.
In May, the game was presented at E3 and everything appeared to be going well, but a major shift began not long afterwards. The title was slated to release in late 2005, but fell behind reportedly due to engine limitations that resulted in levels taking much longer to create than initially planned. Midway had many other games in production at the time, all of which were also running behind on their unrealistic development cycles. They were financially pressured to ship at least one game by the end of the year, and Gauntlet ended up drawing the short straw. Management sent in two new developers to take over production, and it was their job to chop the game up into a playable state and have it shipped by December. Not long after their arrival in July of 2005, John Romero would resign and found his own development studio. A week later, Josh Sawyer revealed that he would be leaving as well to join Obsidian Entertainment. Gauntlet would continue development without them, stripping away the focus on story and RPG mechanics in favor of a bare-bones hack-and-slash game that could be quickly rushed out. It launched later in December of that year, and was more akin to a playable beta than an actual game, containing less than 5 hours of mindless gameplay and receiving even worse reviews than its 3D predecessors. In the rush to ship the game, a tremendous amount was cut, to the point where very little of what was shown in early previews actually made it into the final game, as John Romero revealed. I remember mentioning, "What about the 80% Metacritic you wanted?" They said, "Well, production costs too much money. Metacritic ratings cost too much money. We have to ship this thing." They never told me that if it didn't ship by Christmas 2005, it would be shipped out in a shipbox, but that's what they did. They had an amazing creative services department in San Diego that could do anything, but they screwed up this opportunity to reinvent their franchise. It ended up being a more action-oriented version of what Gauntlet already was. They just chopped it up and made it even crazier. Remember how they were going to make Gauntlet as violent as Mortal Kombat? In early footage, the impact of attacks would send blood flying out from your foes. Bad guys could be thrown and impaled on spikes. Dungeon traps would chop opponents into chunks of meat. The Valkyrie could decapitate enemies, and the warrior could cut them in half. However, it was altered to being teen at the end of development. To attain that rating, dismemberment and even blood would be taken out, the latter of which was replaced by sparkling balls of light when enemies are hit. Fucking brutal. The combat system was cannibalized in more ways than having blood removed. Concept art still hints at the darker tone of the original pitch, depicting a bestiary of various monsters. But in the final game, the vast majority of opponents are humans wearing different types of armor. The throwing ability was cut out entirely. And yet, there are still pits found throughout many levels that enemies were obviously meant to be thrown into. Each class was meant to have 2 co-op abilities called junction skills, which allowed multiple players to define the type and area of effect for either attacking enemies or healing the party. But these aren't in the final game either. Each character also had a unique class skill, like the Valkyrie being able to call down birds to attack her enemies, or the wizard calling down a blizzard to freeze bad guys, another feature that was axed. Each class was also intended to have various skills that could be leveled up, like weapon proficiency and sorcery. But again, most of them were cut, and only damage, mana regen, and health remain in retail. Enemies originally dropped health orbs, which were intended to replace potions, and could be absorbed by inputting a command. You could only draw in orbs that were close by, and if you left them floating around too long, they'd be absorbed by a generator that would then spawn death, a classic deadly enemy from earlier games. They took this out too, and the only time death appears are at predetermined intervals where he can be easily killed by pressing a single button. And how did they change the health system? By taking out the orbs and adding in giant wedges of cheese. While some elements of the combat system remain, there's almost no reason to do anything but mash one attack button. The AI is so bad that most enemies literally run straight at you and slowly attack, meaning there's no advantage to use what remains of the combo or magic systems. In early footage, an equipment screen was shown, and during interviews, Josh mentioned that there would be dozens of variants for weapons, armor, shields, rings, and amulets, which would have varying effects like increasing damage, resistance, speed, and range. Heroes started out knowing how to use one type of weapon, but they could learn up to 2 others as they leveled up. However, this system and even the menu were scrapped. For one, where your weapons and armor are given flat bonuses when you open chests, and you only have a single weapon option per hero. In total, there were 100 different base items the player could acquire, and even trade to other players in the game's online community. Yet another feature that was completely scrapped. It wasn't only violence and gameplay that would be cut though, but also both of the classes that Josh Sawyer designed. Easily the most interesting player character concepts ever devised for a Gauntlet title. At least half of the original advertised levels would get axed too, and several of them are still shown in art by one of the environmental artists. Levels were once intended to be randomly generated to give the campaign more replayability, but this was butchered in favor of linear, static maps. Much of the story that Josh crafted took place in those lost levels, and as a result, the vast majority of it was discarded. What little remains of the plot is mostly told through the intro cinematic played when starting the game. Little is known of the original story, but the synopsis shared in early previews has little resemblance to the final game.
Now, the story of Seven Sorrows has all the immortal heroes spanning the globe to try to undo one mad emperor's lifetime of mistakes. Of course, they tried to assassinate the emperor a few hundred years earlier and were crucified to a magical tree for their crime, but when they wake up, they find that the fate of the world is literally tied to helping the man that they despise. Of course, in the process of undoing these Seven Sorrows, each of the characters has to come to terms with his or her own history of regret. For some, regret is something that they just reject. For others, it's a burden or a learning experience. But each and every one of the heroes has their own unique way of dealing with their past as their journeys inevitably take them home.
During an interview, he also mentioned, quote, "The quartet set out to find what has become of the Emperor, and learn that the Emperor, overcome with regret over 7 acts of cruelty, is attempting to merge himself with the magical energy of the world. He believes that if he can do this, he will be able to reverse the effects of his worst act, the murder of his lover, Kasurime. Unfortunately, merging with the energy of the world is potentially dangerous to the world itself. To prevent the Emperor from tearing the planet apart, the hero set out to undo his 7 sorrows and set his mind at rest. In the release game, the plot is entirely different though. The heroes didn't attempt to assassinate the Emperor, and instead he crucified the heroes to a tree in an attempt to steal their immortality. He was tricked into doing that by his generically evil advisors, and the act of attempting to gain immortality transforms them into monsters. The Emperor then mysteriously dies, and his ghost frees the heroes from their confinement. He then sends them off to kill his advisors, only acting as a narrator that gives nigh on useless level briefings. The Emperor's 7 acts of cruelty are never discussed beyond crucifying the heroes, and I'm convinced the other Sorrows are actually having to play this game. Early footage reveals that the original plot involved the leader of a group called the Flesh Eaters, and their fight against the Aste and Morbus. These groups technically exist in the final game as generic enemies, but have no influence on the plot and are never mentioned by name outside of concept art. In a forum post, Josh gave more insight into the plotline, stating, for example, one of the sorrows is the Emperor's theft of the Inon Stone, a sacred rock upon which the tribes of the Guadme Flesh Eaters anoint their chieftains. For hundreds of years, the imperial governors who rule over the Flesh Eaters have been invested with their imperial office on the stone. It confuses the superstitious Guadme, with half of them believing that the stone confers the right of rulership no matter who uses it, and the other half believing that the stone must be wrested away from the Empire. A new chieftain anointed. Naturally, undoing this sorrow involves the slaughter of hundreds of members of the Imperial Legion and Imperial Guard, as well as dealing with 2 tribes who support the Imperial Governor, Ayar Kolo. There are other elements around this sorrow that make it a little more involved, but that's the general idea. The early build had an in-engine cutscene that tells part of the story, but there are no cutscenes that contain dialogue like this in retail.
This is stupid waiting around. We should be butchering the Imperials instead of hiding back here.
Patience! With the Assetai and Morbus against us, we cannot hope to overcome the Empire here.
So what are we waiting for?
The astrologer.
The astrologer.
Is he real?
No, the astrologer. He's here. He just walked straight out of Penrose with one of the Ilura.
Are you certain it is he? No one has seen him in thousands of moons.
How many other Garou astrologers could be walking out of that dead village with an Ilura beside them?
What is he doing?
He's drawing in the ley lines.
What?
In the final game, playable characters have long-winded descriptions in the manual, but they have no dialogue or distinguishing features. However, previews showed a scene involving the wizard, named Maddock, where he discovers that his daughter was kidnapped, tied to a stone, and then killed.
This is where it happened to her, Elaine. I didn't come to help her when I heard.
Maddock, why didn't you tell me this before?
How could I have helped her? What could I have done?
That was long ago, Maddock. You cannot change the past.
Then I will change the future. Not for the tribes, but for her.
Calm yourself. I understand you're very angry that there are Imperial soldiers and that the Ovate... Maddock, you're bending the ley lines. The Nexuses are going to collapse into you. Maddock, listen to me. Maddock!
This is the line of 1,000 years!
In fact, so little of what Josh made for the title was in the game that he asked to have his name removed from the credits, while John Romero would only be given a special thanks, despite acting as lead designer or creative director for the majority of its development. Remember how Midway brought on members of Act 3 Studio to work on pre-rendered cinematics? The combination of the game being made less violent and many levels being cut resulted in nearly all of them being scrapped, as John Romero revealed. It was totally a case of, there's too much shit, and fewer things to balance mean we ship faster, so chop them out. I wasn't there for any of that, but I heard about it. I believe they hacked the game to 1/3 the size we were going to make it, which meant that all, or almost all of those cinematics were gone. $500,000 of cinematics just thrown away. Years after its release, Josh Sawyer reflected on what went wrong. I came over to work on Gauntlet, and Midway was trying to refocus itself as a leader in mature titles because of Mortal Kombat. They wanted to do it with Gauntlet. I'm like, okay, mature? Like M-rated Gauntlet? Holy crap, what does that look like? I just kind of went wild on it. I came over and John Romero was there as lead designer, and then he took over as creative director and made me the lead designer. I had gone from one sinking ship to another sinking ship because Midway was not in a good position. It just came down to the point where I was really cognizant of not staying at some place where it was really hopeless. Because I should have recognized Interplay was not going to support Black Isle much earlier. At Midway, I was more cognizant of, there is a big company here that doesn't really care about me, and it doesn't really care about you as much as you care about games. Now granted, the development team, it's not like we did things perfectly. We made a lot of mistakes. I can't remember how much money we spent on an intro cinematic that was like super M-rated. Crazy stuff. They were like, hey, we notice a lot of kids play this game. It's kind of a family game. We should make this tea. I'm like, holy crap, dude. The whole game is designed around being M. You've got people chopping heads off and doing all this crazy stuff. And they were like, nope, it's gonna be a teen-rated game. They also wanted to death march everyone for 6 months. They said, okay, we understand that was going to be this much time, but we really need to get the game done, and so we really need you guys to do this. And Midway rewards teams that deliver, so just stick with it. I'm like, I'm out. I'm not going to do it. Because I knew that no matter what, no matter how hard we worked, the game was going to be half-baked. I was like, I did not come here just to make something that is shovelware. Because it was being made just to get it out, and so I left. And a lot of people were actually really mad at me for doing that. I said, I really do not think this is going to go well. Midway was being heavily mismanaged, leading to its bankruptcy in 2009, and Gauntlet would be sold off alongside their other properties. There would be one more Gauntlet title published by Warner Brothers in 2014, but it failed to learn from prior entries and didn't evolve in any meaningful way, leading to average reviews and sales that acted as the final nail in the coffin for one of the longest-running series in gaming. Its death began much earlier when Seven Sorrows was chopped up though, the only game in the franchise that actually tried to become something more. A game that had the potential to reinvent Gauntlet into a mature, narrative-driven title that could have easily garnered a cult following. Instead of reviving the IP, it only provided the opposite, killing it with another outdated, forgettable experience that didn't even satisfy the most dedicated fans. The story of Seven Sorrows is a cautionary tale of how even the best intentions can still lead down the path to development hell.